So, good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Welcome to our session, to this stage. Welcome everyone gathered here on the stage, next to it, and also watching the live stream. We still have one panelist missing. She's on her way. She'll join us shortly, but anyway, to keep the schedule, we will start right away. My name is Tomas Jermalavičius. I'm from International Center for Defense and Security, a think tank in Tallinn, which is co-organizing. I had the pleasure to co-organize this panel together with the British Embassy in Tallinn. Entitled Taking Security for Granted, NATO and the Baltic states. And in the way of introduction, I'll just say that perhaps it's fair to say that the Baltic states have not been as safe in their history as they are now. We are so integrated in all Western political, military, economic institutions and structures as it can get. Even Sweden and Finland are not as well integrated in all those institutions and structures. Sweden is not a member of NATO, not a member of Eurozone. Finland is not a member of NATO. So in a way, we are almost like a Benelux countries of the East. We are everywhere, where we look around. So when it comes to NATO, of course, we enjoy NATO's collective defense guarantees, Article 5 guarantees. And suffice it to say that no state adversary so far has tested or tried to test the credibility of those guarantees head-on by an act of direct military aggression. So it is a very successful alliance when it comes to deterring adversaries. And we are, of course, members of the European Union. I'm sorry to those our British friends that I have to bring this up, but it still confers significant benefits of being inside the EU in this 500 million people, rich, wealthy common market, and enjoy its also solidarity and mutual support during the crisis. So we probably could be excused for taking our security a little bit for granted. We should just basically sit back and enjoy all the benefits of those memberships, all the benefits of the hard work we did of integrating into those political, economic, and military structures. But we're still living in a rough neighborhood. Russia has not gone away. Putinism has not gone away. Belarus and its dictator is totally now unhinged, and it's really a rough neighborhood. And in general, the world is tumultuous as well. We are facing a climate emergency. We're still dealing with a global pandemic. And the conflicts around the world are numerous. The migration flows are flowing into Europe, the wealthier parts of the world. And of course, since Crimea's annexation, which, poetically speaking, and often is referred as entirely is a climate change in European security, not just a period of bad weather. Since Crimea, we, the Baltic states, NATO, the EU, have done a lot to bolster our security. And militarily, we've increased defense budgets. We invested more significantly into defense capabilities, including regenerating some of those that we shed away during the post-Cold War period. NATO's adaptation is in full swing, and also we have NATO's presence in the Baltics, NATO force integration units, enhanced forward presence, battle groups in all three Baltic states and Poland. We have enhanced Baltic air policing operation. We have numerous exercises every year. We have also addressed issues related to broader security, be it strengthening our cybersecurity, countering disinformation, countering hybrid threats, as they're called, ensuring our energy security. So we've done a lot since this massive shift in security climate in Europe. But the question is are we really doing enough, all of us, the Baltic states, NATO, the EU, but particularly Baltic states and NATO, since this is the topic of the panel, or are we just lulling ourselves into this false sense of security? So often I get the impression that we congratulate ourselves, having done a lot, having and doing a lot, but is it really enough? The key question is, does that all deter Russia? And what actually deters Russia from its acts of aggression against our security? And it is assertive. It is trying to erode our security, not head-on perhaps, but without attacking us directly, but through other avenues and by other means. So, is our deterrence edifice that we're building in the region is sufficient? Is deterrence that we've been building broad and dynamic enough to shape the calculus in the Kremlin and dissuade them from the acts of aggression against our security, against our territorial integrity, against our sovereignty? And as Lithuania's case illustrates, the sense of security can be shattered literally overnight. So are we really doing enough? And we have a great panel to discuss these and other questions that we pose. I mentioned one is missing, so I'll introduce her, but Kari Silda, Under Secretary for Defense Policy at the Estonian Ministry of Defense, will be joining us hopefully very shortly. Then we have Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Hing, British Defense Attaché to Estonia, and Indrek Sirp, who is Director of Security and Defense Coordination Unit at the Government Office of Estonia. And for some Baltic flavor, you have a Lithuanian in the moderator's chair. But before giving floor to the speakers, I have to mention that you have a possibility to put forward your views via a polling platform, Slido. So you just have to go, also those who are watching the live stream, not only those sitting here, and I would really encourage you to actively participate. We don't have that many questions there, but your inputs will be interesting points for discussion later on. So just go to the website, Slido, enter the code, which should be appearing here on the screen as well, which is 398404. And answer the questions we pose. I'll be letting you know when the polling starts and on a particular question, and actually we will be able to start with question 1 very shortly, which is basically what are the biggest security threats as you see to the Baltic states? And this is an open-ended question, so you basically can write in your words. This will generate a word cloud that we'll be looking at and trying to make sense of it. You can enter several answers into that, each up to 30 characters. So you can basically start now, and I can see there's a very funny answer already, United States. We will have to discuss these things, and I'm really curious about the outcome. But without any further ado, I want to start perhaps with Indrek here. We all agree that security is not just about military defense. It's much broader phenomena. You have a very important responsibility as overseeing and coordinating this, what we call a whole of government, a whole of society approach to ensuring security and defense of this country. And back in 2014, if I remember correctly, at the request of the Estonian Parliament, ICDS drew up a report on comprehensive security and integrated defense in Estonia, and the findings of which revealed not such a shiny picture. That was 7 years ago. So I'm really curious to hear how we are faring now when it comes to augmenting national defense with civilian capabilities and vice versa, depending on the character of a particular security crisis. Ensuring coherence between various actors in responding to a security crisis on our soil, and how these measures that we are taking are really aligning with the overall threat picture, that we have. Where if really the security is bigger than just military, then perhaps we should really pay more attention to non-military aspect of security. So Indrek, over to you, and Kadi is jumping in, but you'll be the last to speak then as a punishment.
Well, thank you, Tomas, so much for nice words for introduction. And thanks, organizers, for putting up this panel. It's great to be here. Well, August is the month when things tend to happen, and not good things, but often bad things. So it is a very good time to talk about security. And Tomas, since you are from Lithuania, I will actually start from Lithuania. So the thing that is going on in Lithuania, the migration crisis, essentially a hybrid attack by the Lukashenko regime against Lithuania in order to achieve the political goals. It's an ongoing crisis, and it is way too early to make any conclusions or get lessons identified and lessons learned. But it is a good case to explain three things, and I will take them one by one. First of all, the dynamic nature of the threat environment that we are facing, and hybrid threats in particular. Second, national resilience and how we should respond to these kind of threats. And thirdly, the role of the EU and NATO in our security. So let me start from the first one. I'm sure that the Lukashenko campaign will become a kind of a modern classic case of hybrid warfare that think tank papers and academic analysis will talk about in the future. So what is going on there? Lukashenko being unhappy because of the sanctions that the EU put on Belarus, wants to lift them, and is now using illegal migration as a weapon, as a tool to influence the decision-making in Vilnius and other European Union capitals, as well as in Brussels. And on top of the migrants sent to Lithuanian border, his regime uses propaganda and disinformation, the information campaign, to make it even harder to counter. So the illegal immigration is nothing new. Obviously, it is not a new thing used as a political weapon. We've seen it also in the region, organized by Russia in 2015 and 2016 against Finland and Sweden. And the fact that it comes from the Russian playbook obviously should make us a little bit more worrisome looking at this phenomena of illegal immigration. Now, talking about Russia, on the current regime of Putin, Russia obviously is the most serious threat to Estonian security. And this threat spans from classic military threat to espionage, to influence operations, cyber attacks, and so on. Right now, they are getting ready for the Zapad military exercise. And it remains to be seen what kind of show they will put up this time. Normally it takes place every 4th year. It takes place on the territories of Russia and Belarus. At this point, we have no signs that the exercise will be out of the routine of the Zapad exercises. But we will be looking at this, obviously, with a lot of attention. Thus, Russia, Belarus, hybrid means classic military threats. This kind of creates our security environment, and it is tense, it is dynamic, and it is multi-dimensional. So coming to my second point, how to counter this? We need to have resilience of the society, we need to have national defense. And resilience, if you ask what does it mean, it is basically ability to sustain cohesion of the state and the country despite internal or external disruptions. And disruptions may be global pandemic like COVID, it may be a flow of illegal migrants, it may be even war or armed conflict. Now our defense forces and defense league, they form the backbone of the military defense posture. However, many civilian agencies and ministries and municipalities and even private sector companies play a very crucial role in making sure that the Estonian society and the country is secure. To make these different stakeholders work efficiently, we need to have a very robust and comprehensive mechanism. And right now we're actually reforming Estonian national defense system and crisis management system to put them into one integrated system so that planning and chain of command and everything is done in a very combined and joint manner. And if you look at this Belarusian campaign against Lithuania and other Baltic nations, we see actually this kind of approach in action. We produce a common operational picture using information from all sources that are available for us. We pursue joint strategic planning of how to help Lithuania at this point, in the future also Latvia, but also how to defend ourselves if this kind of contingency should take place at the Estonian borders. So no single ministry or agency can do it alone. And our task, and my task at the government office, is to make this as a team effort, to make the team work at the governmental strategic level. Now, coming to the third point and the last one, really is how we see NATO and the EU in all of this picture. I think the crisis in Lithuania shows the value of being a member of NATO and the EU. If a member state is under pressure or is attacked, it can get practical help, obviously, and assistance from those organizations. But more importantly, it can get the feeling of solidarity and this unit of effort from NATO and the EU. And we see it's coming now, even if it's August and Western Europe they are on holidays. Even now, the EU and NATO has kind of started its machinery, and we see that support is coming to Lithuania. The EU is providing financial assistance, border guards through Frontex, and so on. And NATO, which is mostly the military organization and has its strength in military power and collective defense, even NATO is considering seriously how to help Lithuania at this point with non-military capabilities. Like counter-hybrid support teams, which Lithuania has requested and NATO is considering at this point. So my final point on NATO, before I conclude, is that I had the opportunity to be at the NATO summit this June, and the atmosphere at the summit, at the meeting, was very strongly showing transatlantic unity. And it may be just a kind of a symbol, but President Biden was sitting at this meeting for the entire duration of the meeting, unlike some other leaders who left in the meantime. And I think it shows that U.S. commitment under this administration is very strong towards NATO and our security. So we can be quite satisfied with how the things are with NATO and the EU as well in terms of our security.
Yeah, thank you very much, Indrek. And I'm really glad that you brought up, first of all, the Lithuania situation at the moment, and also this keyword of resilience, because for two reasons. One is that it's obvious that in Lithuania the target is the cohesion and resilience of the society and its political system, the key sort of centers of gravity that are under attack, and with a variety of means, primarily the migrant flows, but there will be other things coming our way as well, for sure, and NATO's role. And this raises an interesting question, sort of which connects to the second point, the resilience. Resilience normally is, and it's within NATO's and EU's parlance or policies, it's a national responsibility. Although I say, national responsibility until it's not. But in this regard, also NATO has 7 baseline requirements for its members regarding resilience, which are all connected to Article 3 of Washington Treaty. And then there are those who say, okay, this is primarily a military alliance. It's the master of military tool, military instrument, and now we want it to do more and become a bit broader in how it supports its allies, how individual allies, how it helps to build resilience and so on. So, in the sense, what is our expectation now of NATO and NATO's transformation, and so on? Now, do we want it to become more than just a military alliance and more than just focused on collective military defense? or if we still wanted to remain at the core, this sort of a military instrument in our security.
Well, NATO is a political and military alliance, and military is obviously the kind of the most important core of NATO, and it has had actually for many years kind of more political and more non-military kind of roles and tasks, and as well as capabilities. I think it should stay this way. However, from Estonian perspective, it is really important to focus, given the current security environment, to have the focus on the traditional NATO's function, which is collective defense. And out of the summit I was speaking about came a couple of very important decisions that will strengthen defense and deterrence of NATO, and it gives a good kind of a map of how to move ahead in making sure that we have necessary forces, plans, and they are exercised as well. And Kadi, I guess, can speak about this in a more detailed way, but this is a really good kind of step forward. And there's nobody in NATO that would thought that this is unnecessary or nothing that we should be doing. So there's a strong, united, common effort in this regard.
Right. Thank you, Enrico. We'll come back to in the discussion to some of the points you make, but I want to move on. And I'm glad also mentioned the United States as showing its commitment to transatlantic security and defense and our region's defense. But there's another country which is very important to us and is very involved, very committed to our security, to our defense in the region, and that's the United Kingdom. It leads the Enhanced Forward Presence battle group here. It also participates in enhanced Baltic air policing, and in many ways it's a key partner to the Baltic states in their security and defense efforts. But at the same time, just recently the UK government published integrated review of security, defense, development and foreign policy, and when you read it, you can feel and see that their strategic attention has been shifting a little bit from Europe towards Indo-Pacific. Now it's very fashionable for everyone is talking about Indo-Pacific, to the point that even drew a rebuke from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, that UK probably should focus more on European security and Russia's threat. And when you read the same review, Estonia, for instance, there are a number of European countries mentioned as UK's partners in Europe, priority partners and so on, but the Baltic states are not really mentioned. It's better in the MOD's follow-up document, the Defense Command Paper. And this really kind of invites the question, should we be worried that there will be some sort of attention deficit in the future that will turn into some kind of involvement deficit as well in the future? And that's why I want to now turn to Matthew and hear your thoughts, and that it may be some reassurance that it's not going to be the case, and the UK will stay really involved and in the lead in many of the efforts here in the region. Matthew.
Thank you, Thomas, and thanks for the introduction. And it's really great to be on this panel with such great and distinguished colleagues, and thank you very much to ICDS for helping to put this together. Really, I'll answer your question first, and I think it's a very simple answer. The defence of the UK starts at the edge of NATO. That's it. So whatever you may read in any conclusions you draw from the integrated review and the Defence Command Paper and other government publications, that's a fact. It's been a fact for 70 years, and it's a fact today, and it'll be a fact tomorrow, and it'll be a fact when NATO is 100 years old. So coming back to that, and actually the integrated review and picking up on a couple of points made by Tomas and Indrek, really answering the question of the panel today, taking security for granted. For me, talking on behalf of my Ministry of Defence, is the UK taking security for granted? Is NATO taking security for granted? Well, when I look at this and analyse it on all metrics, absolutely not. So even before the events of 2013, if you go back to 2006, all NATO members agreed to spend at least 2% of GDP on defence. We then had the economic crash in 2008, which derailed that. We then had the reality check in 2014, which then at the Wales summit allowed the NATO members to reinvigorate that 2% pledge and the readiness action plan. So when you look at activity, and Tomas mentioned a few there, and I'm just looking in Estonia specifically, from 2014, enhanced Baltic air policing missions flying from Amri Air Base for the first time. 2015, the establishment of a NATO force integration unit designed to speed up the rapid reinforcement of the area. 2017, the enhanced forward periscope battle group with the UK as a framework nation, supported by Danish and French allies, deployed to Estonia. And here, quoting my Prime Minister and my Secretary of State for Defence, for as long as you need us to be so. So NATO has done a lot of assurance and the Readiness Action Plan assurance and adaptation measures. But when you look, and that's just activity. But also when you look at spending, and I come back to the 2%, since 2014, defence spending has risen year on year for 7 consecutive years now to 2021, a total of an additional $260 billion. And all NATO members have pledged to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defence by 2024. So when you look at activity, there's positive action. When you look at spending, there's positive action. And also conceptually, we mentioned the UK's integrated review, and I'll do this in chronological order rather than importance order. So in March, the UK published its integrated review, and to give it its full name, it's the Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy. Hence we shorten it, because that's quite a mouthful. But actually, it's important. I thought it was important to do that so you understood what the integrated part was about. It's a cross-government view of the world. It's a UK's threat assessment. And it came up with 4 main themes. And these are that the world is becoming more competitive and more multipolar. There are geopolitical and economic shifts. There are systemic competition between states and values and their systems. There is rapid technological change. And there are transnational challenges such as climate change and biodiversity risks. Now, the reason I mention this is because these are not specific to the UK. These affect the whole of NATO. And actually, a lot of the logic that was in the integrated review follows through, probably by some great work by our British colleagues in NATO, follows through into the NATO 2030 paper, which Indrek mentioned was signed off and agreed at the NATO summit back in June. So if you look at activity, positive change, spending, positive change, and also coming back to the UK point, the UK, prior to issuing the integrated review, the government agreed a comprehensive spending settlement of an initial 24 billion over 4 years for defence. So it's not just UK that's spending more, it's also, not just NATO that's spending more, but specifically the UK is spending more. So activity is good, spending is good, and the conceptual vision, the integrated view looks out to 2030, and also NATO's the NATO 2030 package, obviously looking out to 2030. So conceptually, there is activity, and then the supporting implementation plans will follow over the next couple of years. So from my perspective, where I sit here, and I'm more than happy to be challenged, which is the purpose of the panel, are we taking security for granted? Is NATO, is the UK, is Estonia? Absolutely not, because when I look at those metrics I've laid out for you, I just don't see it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, mate. This is valuable reminder that there's a lot of being done that shows that we are not taking security for granted. But there's one thing that I wanted as a quick follow-up, that there's a lot of discussion that as a result of its conceptual rethinking of how defense should be constructed, that the UK, for instance, will be investing more in a very high-tech qualitative edge over the adversaries, which probably will mean a bit of a loss of quantitative mass in terms of numbers of soldiers, and in terms of numbers of platform systems available, more the traditional kind. And that worries us in the Baltics often because, sometimes we say, okay, so if we get into this big pub brawl with Russia, some countries like the UK might end delivering a few heavy quality punches, but might not endure the entire pub brawl because there will just not be enough mass around. Because mass in war and warfare still has a quality of its own. So, could you just reassure that you'll still have enough tanks and artillery pieces and bombers and whatnot, when it comes to and precision guided munitions, when it comes to really delivering a mass, not only the quality edge?
I knew you would ask that question. It's a very difficult one to answer. And I'll give you a little bit of history first. My first posting in the army, I went to Germany in 1991. The army had 150,000 people, 50,000 of which were in Germany. Over the next few months, years or so, as a result of the very real and very obvious peace dividend at the end of the Cold War and subsequent defence reviews, the army has broadly been on a downward trajectory, and will do again slightly from the integrated review. So yes, we've moved away from mass, but so has the battlefield, and the character of warfare has evolved as well. We need a balance of both. It's a very diplomatic answer, I know, but we do need a balance of both. And one of the strong things which came out in the integrated review and the way that the UK is going to respond to the threats that I laid out was trying to sustain our strategic edge in the science and technology field, because that is important. But that costs. And therefore, and that's the challenge of the Ministry of Defence, that's the challenge of any government, is how, even though you spend 2% or more, is how you divide that 2% up to make sure you've got... It's not necessarily about mass. I would suggest it's about balance, and it's getting a balance in your forces that you can have that deterrent effect when and where you want to do it, and also have a military effect when and where you want to do it. And for the UK as a global power, and I know you mentioned a focus, the Indo-Pacific, it means across the globe.
Right, thank you very much, Matthew. And this is actually ties in also now with very nicely with what I wanted to start with talking with Kadi. This balance also means, for instance, we have the EFP battle group led by the UK, which in a way you can say is symbolic. It's a tripwire force. It cannot achieve on its own a lot, but it would trigger, hopefully, a massive, big response from the entire alliance. And it also matters that this battle group has as a lead nation a nuclear power. UK's nuclear power, and also involvement of another nuclear power, French. This is a tripwire force, but it's a result of a very long of a process of planning and putting it in place. And I remember in 2016 we helped with Kadi to put together a report which was authored by Generals Wesley Clark, former SACEUR, and Richard Chirev, former DSACEUR, British General, Egon Rams, and Yuri Luik, who was our director at that time. And it was called NATO's Baltic Gap. And it was argued in that report that essentially NATO has a lot of gaps in terms of capabilities in the region. Some of those gaps have been closed and addressed, but many others remain in place. And you would look at some of the papers written by analysts, by policymakers, that the more needs to be done. And that's why I'm turning to you, Kari. How satisfied are you with the current level of achievement of what NATO and us, the Baltic states, have achieved here in the region in strengthening our deterrence? And what gaps still remain that perhaps cause you and your colleagues in the MOD and then defense forces lose some sleep at night?
Thanks a lot, Tomas. You warned me before about bringing up the report, so I opened it up again now after 5 years, and one of the first sentences I saw in the report was that the Baltic states have 1,400 kilometers with Russia and Belarus, whereas just 65 with the rest of NATO. So, but this 1,400 kilometers of border now has a whole different meaning and threat. But before I go into what's been done and where the gaps still lie, I just answer the first question, or the topic of the panel. Are we taking security for granted? I mean, if we look at the present situation, then it's almost a textbook example of what we've been afraid of in terms of all the things that are happening at the same time. I mean, our starting position is not that great to begin with. We talk about our time, distance, forces gap here in the Baltic states, meaning that Russia has more forces, can act more rapidly, etc., etc. And even though many analysts, some countries talk about Russia being a declining power, then I'd use the same example as is sometimes used with Brazil. They say Brazil is and always will be the country of the future, whereas with Russia is and always will be the next declining power. But even during this COVID crisis, I mean, militarily they did pretty well. If you look at different metrics, if you look at how they managed to fill their aims for taking in conscripts, etc. So they showed that they do manage and are not perhaps as declining as some claim to be. Now, when we look at what else is happening, the hybrid attack, the hybrid situation in Lithuania, which is of course now not just happening in Lithuania, it's happening against Latvia, it's happening against Poland. This is tying up resources of these countries. Both Latvia and Lithuania are using their military resources to handle that situation, so they are tied up. If we look at what Russian armed forces are doing, then they are increasing their readiness. They are about to start in August their large-scale exercise Zapas that Indrek touched upon already. If we look at Russia's sort of self-confidence, then the escapade in Ukraine, vaccine diplomacy, etc., I would say has given them quite a bit of confidence. If we look at what is happening in the world at large, then we see the United States, but not only, others as well, now tied up with what is happening in Afghanistan. So their attention is not just in the Indo-Pacific, is also managing this enormous problem that we are facing in Afghanistan. So in a way, all the elements that we normally look for, that we are afraid of, where there's an opportunity for our neighbors to the east to create problems, are in a way there. So we have to be more careful, and so I don't think we're taking our security for granted. Our neighbor to the east helps us not to do that. In terms of what we are doing and where the gaps still lie, Indrek talked about the summit. I know these panels are much better when someone disagrees with something, but I find it hard to disagree with anything that Indrek or Matt has said, so I apologize to the audience. I mean, in a way, this summit didn't bring anything as concrete or tangible. I mean, before we've seen the EFP brought to Estonia, we've seen air policing come to Estonia, and this time around there was no sort of one shiny thing in collective defense. So it was for our communications people, it was a little bit a harder sell than it normally is, which does not mean at all that really important work is not being done. It's just you know, in a setting like this, if I start talking about modernizing NATO's force structure, you'll go over to the cafe, so I won't do that. but I assure you, it's as important as the EFP, which I will come back to in a second, because as all the previous speakers said, the EFP is a tripwire force, but we need a functioning reinforcement strategy. We need to be sure that the overwhelming amount of forces that would convince Russia not to do anything can be here and can be here quickly. Now, if we come to the EFP, then it really is, I would say, the best tripwire force in the Baltic states, because it is not just a symbolic unit. It is a unit that is very much integrated with Estonian forces and that is militarily capable and will and can act. And our British friends assure us that if worse came to worse, their unit would act alongside ours. So I think it's a very much credible deterrent. I mean, the bulk of the work that is still to be done is on reinforcement. I apologize. I will mention again this modernization of NATO's force structure. Please don't go away. But we need to get the rest of NATO's forces in a state where there's enough forces at a sufficient level of readiness that they can. That they are able to move to our region when need be. Of course, the resilience sort of toolbox is something that needs work as well. It's of course not just a purview of NATO, but in many instances also the EU. In terms of what else we can do, one of the issues where perhaps we've not been as good before, but we're trying to get better is regional cooperation, Baltic cooperation, also cooperation with Poland. I mean, there's always been a lot. I mean, there's a number of working groups, there's a lot of meetings, but if we talk about actual capability development, joint capability development, there isn't been all that much. And the truth of the matter is, even if we all spend about 2%, our GDPs are not going to expand enormously. So there's only so much that we can, on our own, afford for this money. So what we are looking for, and where certainly the gap lies, is strategic capabilities that we could develop and own and operate jointly with the Baltic states. And then perhaps last, you mentioned the issue of new technologies. This is something that is viewed by us and also in NATO increasingly as a critical element of its deterrence and defense posture. If we want to not just surpass, but just to keep up with our competitors and adversaries, we need to pool our resources there, not just money, also talent. And one of the decisions taken during this NATO summit was to create sort of a NATO innovation initiative called Diana. And this is something that Estonia attached a lot of importance, the UK as well, and that we hope will be launched by next summit, and hopefully will deliver us the capabilities that we need. So with that, I'd
Thank you,
wrap up.
Kadi. This is a very, very broad and wide-ranging input, and I'm really glad you brought up this Baltic regional cooperation issue. It's probably one of those like Brazil-like topics that it has a bright future and will always do. But nonetheless, I think this is the right note to strike here. But the question is, even with these small amounts that we have, and Estonia actually tends to bring up the Baltic cooperation and joint things a bit more when the budgets are being cut. When Estonia is overflowing with the defense money, it's not so much interested in talking about the Baltic cooperation. Then the Latvians and Lithuanians do, because they get the cuts. But in any case, are there ways, that we can spend these small budgets smarter? Better, to deliver, better bang for a buck, and have more capability. Certainly there are certain things we should do more about. And one example, just not to put the words in your mouth, but now Estonia decided to purchase the coastal defense missiles. Right, that's in the plan now, which has some populist origins as well, as we all know. But nonetheless, it's in the plan. But in order to make best use of this capability, we really need a proper maritime domain awareness and situational awareness. But here we are underperforming. Shouldn't we start, to integrate our systems of maritime surveillance, civil and military, and so on across the board, so we can actually integrate this coastal defense, missile systems into already kind of a capable system and seeing farther, better into the sea. So it's just one example. But are there any ways that we can make smarter investments with this small money that we have?
Yes, this coastal defense is again not the best example of Baltic cooperation, but I suppose that's the challenge, that we don't start thinking about cooperation once we're about to procure something, but we do the planning together. We do it long term. We think much longer ahead than we normally do, because with all these strategic capabilities, all of us have the money at different stages in our budgets. So to square that, you have to start thinking together, planning together much longer than just a few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Indrek, you wanted to jump in, right?
Yes, I wanted to jump in on the maritime security. I think it won't bring any savings, at least in the short distance or short period, when we put together our two fleets, Navy and the Coastal Guard fleet. It is being analyzed now for I don't know for how many times now. It's been third probably analysis that is being done to see whether we can do it and what are the financial, legal and other implications. But clearly, Estonian maritime border and the sea territory is pretty large, and we need to be at sea to understand what the Russians are actually doing there, and other friends of Russia that are sailing sometimes on the Baltic Sea, to defend ourselves like militarily if needed, but also to understand those non-military threats that may come from the sea. So let's see how this analysis will go. And the government is expecting to get something out of it by the end of this year, I guess. We'll see. But maybe it's a smart move in the long term to also get some savings.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we need to pause now a little bit and look at the results of the first question polling. What are these? What our audience sees as the biggest threats to the Baltic security? And the biggest sort of keywords are climate change, Russia, and populism. Now, any comments from the panelists on these keywords? The Russia, obviously, we've spoken a lot about, but why would you see populism? For instance, and how does our security and defense agenda also reflect climate change as a security threat to the national security of the Baltic states? Are we really doing enough in that regard? And how does defense at all play a role in it? Yeah.
well, maybe maybe our UK friend can
from the integrated
jump in.
perspective.
If not, I mean,
I will do. Yeah, I think there are two angles. One of which is defence, and it's in the media is a big polluter. So we have lots of ships, aircraft, tanks that burn diesel and other fuels. So there's an internal piece of work which is going on within the UK Ministry of Defence to try and green our fleets now and in the future, and look at alternatives. There's lots of very good sense why that has to happen, and that will develop over the next couple of years. Especially people looking forward when we do procurement, then the green agenda is absolutely the front and foremost of there. And then the second aspect, climate change, is not defence's role in climate change, but defence's role in dealing with the consequences of climate change. So where climate change is causing instability, and we're already seeing it around the world, it is forcing migration, which is putting pressure on borders. I know the Belarus angle is not quite the same, but it's that it could lead to that sort of event, as it's happening in the southern fringes of Europe from North Africa predominantly. We saw in the last few years how NATO and the EU work together to help those countries with Mediterranean borders to deal with ultimately the consequences of climate change. So there are definitely some defence angles. One, to do better ourselves, and B, to be prepared to help governments respond.
Kari, Indrek, do you see, talking about populism, the third word here, a very big one, how do you see that impacting your work and then, our security and defense sort of cohesion and then policies and the strength of our national security?
Well, it is a phenomenon that we have to take into account, especially when we think about kind of internal security. We see that many people who are unhappy because of different things. Some people are anti-vaccine. Some people are think that the government is not doing enough for the well-being, and some people are just looking for possibilities to stir the pot and get things or make things complicated for the government. So, and if these different groups kind of come together and line up, in one place, that may be a problem. 2 days ago in Vilnius, we saw mass protests that ended in fights between police and protesters, and there were a bunch of people, with different aims and different really agendas. And also, as I understand from the public media, at least, some politicians kind of urging the people to come out and make their voice heard on those controversial matters. And we saw something similar in Tallinn in March and April, when people were angry because of COVID regulations and masks and so on. And some other, figures kind of came into the crowds who normally have those, Kremlin kind of positions supporting Kremlin positions, and this mix can get, can get at one point very complicated for the government agencies. So it is a phenomenon that we have to take into account.
That's a very good point. Thank you. Good answer. Kari, before I sort of bring one issue which is on the screen, I want to close this one and open a new polling question, which will be basically a good reflection what you think, how this should translate into where we put our money into. So the question is, the Baltic states should increase their defense spending by a lot, by a little. They should neither increase nor decrease it, or they should decrease it. Start voting on this one. Will be interesting to see whether those who are fans of the military really want to put their money where their mouth is. But to Kari, there was one interesting point. Somebody put as a greatest threat to the Baltic security the United States. Now, to turn it a bit around. Okay, so what we've recently seen, and that's probably a bit against what Indrek spoke about. United States has just thrown Afghanistan under the bus. It also has thrown Ukraine under the bus with Nord Stream 2. In a way, that makes me a little concerned, because what sort of a message that sends to those who challenge the United States and challenge NATO alliance and transatlantic security. And when it comes to defense, aren't we really putting too many eggs into the same basket and counting too much on the US being all times here to support us, rather than instead diversifying a little bit, maybe putting a little bit more attention to European Defence Cooperation? And you're, as a policy director in the MOD, I know you're probably in the thick of it when it comes to discussing our position towards the European Defence Cooperation. So what are your thoughts about the US role and position and credibility sometimes when it comes to security, transatlantic security and defense?
I think there's a very clear distinction between the different obligations and commitments that the United States has, and the sort of treaty commitments that the United States has in NATO, it does not have in most other corners of the world. So we do not doubt U.S. commitment. But in terms of putting our eggs in one basket, I actually don't agree at all. If you look at the different deterrence and defense measures, not just in Estonia, but in all the Baltic states, then they are predominantly manned and fulfilled by European countries. Our biggest commitments abroad are with the French in Sahel. So the fact that we need to have European powers engaged as well is not something that we've missed or not paid attention to. But of course, there's also distinction between European Defence Cooperation and EU. European Defence Cooperation, to be honest, most of it happens outside of EU. Most of our operational commitments in Sahel, for example, are not in the framework of EU. Where the EU comes in and is very important for us as the defence establishment as well is with its broad toolbox that relates to resilience in its widest possible meaning. And there's a lot that the EU does that we think NATO shouldn't do, because again, agreeing with Indrek, we understand that NATO needs to pick up a few new topics here and there as well, but we want it to stay predominantly a transatlantic defense organization. So there's a lot of things that sometimes pop up and we think, is NATO really the right organization for that? I mean, for instance, in a lot of issues that concern China, the right sort of venue for that discussion is not so much NATO, but is EU and EU-US dialogue.
Very good answer, thank you. And I'm really glad you brought up this whole treaty commitments, because we'll come to that in a moment. And NATO also even now started indicating that Article 5 could be activated also in the case of devastating cyber attack, or for instance attack against the space-based systems as well. So it's kind of the breadth of this Article 5 applicability in the Allies' eyes also has been expanding. But before we come to Article 5 discussion, maybe let's look at the screen and what do the people want. And 44% of our bold ones want the defense spending be increased by a lot, and 28% by a little, and only 8% say they should decrease it. So Indrek, in Estonia, basically the government is fulfilling our minority will, because only 8% want to see the cuts in defense budget, and 44% want to see this increase by a lot. But Estonia has just cut the defense budget, as many other budget items. How does that square with this, 2% commitment? Because we run now a risk of not reaching 2%. The economy is growing. the defense spending is decreasing. So how does that square with all this nice rhetoric about us standing firm on defense spending and the people's will as well? You know, a bit populist here, but still.
Well, it's good to see that so many people are supporting more defense spending. I don't mind. I wouldn't mind. I would support it as well. But not only more defense or more money for defense, but also more money for kind of general resilience and crisis management and internal security. So why not? The decisions, obviously, on the budget are made by politicians and the government and eventually the parliament. So it is their responsibility to look at the whole picture of Estonia and take into account different needs, be it in social affairs, education, or elsewhere. So it is their responsibility. No, the 2% commitment has been there for many years, and it will be there. So nobody has changed that. And yes, indeed, there were some cuts, but they were kind of also cuts from the kind of prospective future budgets. Well, we'll see I guess in few weeks when the new economic prognosis will come out and the government will start again talks on the next year's budget. What will be the result there? But obviously, it is their responsibility. We, from our side, are good at making proposals on how to spend this money and bringing together different needs from different ministries. Pushing through the clearhouse what is necessary and what is less necessary, and the government then can make a proper decision on it.
Right, good, thank you. Before we move on, I want to open the last question of our polling, if possible, and that pertains to the very heart of the discussion, about our sort of fears and sense of security or insecurity. If the Baltic states are attacked, will NATO come to their assistance? Interestingly, the previous session here on this stage focused on the question of trust. So this is basically the question of trust in NATO's collective defense guarantees. But then this is Matthew is grabbing a microphone. I'm sure you have something to say about this. How much trust we can invest into this rather vaguely actually articulated worded article, which basically says that our countries or allies are committed to assist by all means they regard necessary to assist the attacked members. So if your government decides or your parliament decides that sending a card with regrets to Tallinn and saying, we regret you've been attacked and we are deeply concerned, and that's all that it regards as necessary, then it's probably not the essence of or the spirit of Article 5. But in your view as a military, during the Cold War we had a lot of this automaticity. If there are tanks pouring across the border from the Warsaw Pact, that's an attack. Everybody is attacked and everybody is defending against this attack. These days, with this gray zone aggression, all this kind of Belarusian kind of Lukashenko type tricks and so on, it might be difficult to say when this Article 5 should even apply. So, Matt, what are your views on the credibility of this, spirit of it?
I think in the UK, this is not a question. We will respond. In fact, we've already responded because we've got 850 British troops in Tapa permanently. We're already here. We're already involved in whatever that crisis is. I think then the question then becomes about how we respond. We've talked a lot about NATO, but one organisation which is consensus-based, therefore, I think the implication in the question you were asking was there's ambiguity in a hybrid. All threats are deliberately ambiguous. So therefore, there is a difficulty. Therefore, you can assume there will be a difficulty gaining consensus within NATO for NATO action. So what? You need a plan B. What's a plan B? The one organisation we've not talked about is the Joint Expeditionary Force. So just to expand that gives those partners and anybody else who wishes to act.
Just can you explain to the audience what it is?
I'll explain to that. So the Joint Expeditionary Force is it's got 10 members, including the Baltic states, and importantly bringing in non-NATO members of Sweden and Finland, the Netherlands, Iceland, Denmark, Norway, UK. I think I've got everybody. Yeah. Apologies if I haven't. 10 like-minded nations who meet regularly and plan this type of crisis response. There are work groups in there about interoperability, but actually it's a response option for those nations. And that could just be 2 nations, it doesn't have to be all 10. It's not consensus based, it's more what needs to be done, okay, who wants to take some action to do it? And that could be anything from a natural disaster to more the recognition that a hybrid attack is taking place. And this is an important organisation because it then allows nations to have a credible framework in which to operate, in which to respond militarily in support of whichever government or governments are being threatened, whilst NATO, because of the issue or perceived issue of consensus brought about by hybrid threats and ambiguity, is debating and working out how best to respond and get that consensus across nations who directly or indirectly may not be affected by this.
Kadi, is that the way you think in the MOD, that if something really, happens very bad and it's kind of an Article 5-like situation, that what we'll be first seeing is the coalition of the willing, perhaps even including countries like Sweden, not a member of NATO, coming to help rather than NATO? And NATO will be something, that will move much slower. There is, more deliberate, more deliberation, disagreements. What are your concerns about the NATO's speed of response, if necessary, especially to more ambiguous situations?
Well, as I started off, when I started off, I said that the sort of time disadvantage that we have here is so large that we have to, of course, bear in mind the possibility that 30 countries might not be able to agree as quickly as we need them to. So Jeff, indeed, is a very valuable tool in that regard. Of course, we hope and we think that NATO will not fail, but sometimes we need someone to act sort of in anticipation of NATO, in a way to deny Russia the opportunity to establish facts on the ground, and by that to buy more time for NATO. So Jeff is one option for that. Of course, we have similar discussions with the United States. That is another one. So
French European Intervention Initiative.
Indeed, indeed.
Indrek, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, the good thing about Article 5 is that it is not defined exactly what would trigger it. So it's always a political decision, and if a member state thinks that its security is threatened, it can always go to North Atlantic Council and ask for Article 5. And I think nations don't do it like lightheartedly. Article 5 has been evoked once, and I think maybe it wasn't even the US who was the first one who went to NAC. I think there were other members who thought that 9/11 was a serious attack enough on the US that NATO needed to act. And if a few years before that, somebody would have defined that Article 5, would be triggered by an attack, then nobody would have thought that the attack would occur in such a manner, I guess, using a civilian airplane and then hitting a building. But it did. So it is very good that Article 5 kind of stays a little bit, not defined. And it will be defined when the moment comes.
Well, this is actually, before we close the poll, I want to actually put forward this thought, which was triggered by what is happening now in Lithuania and sort of all the political internal divisions and so on. Let's imagine a situation: the government attacked this way is paralyzed, divided, unwilling even to ask, although it's clearly under attack, by external forces, but it's unwilling to recognize that and perhaps even compromise from within to do so. Can NATO activate Article 5 without the government in question even asking for it or even being present at the table?
it's a very complicated situation that you are picturing.
Well, that's a dark scenario, but this is where the Russia's attack or Belarusian vector of attack lies.
Again, I mean, it all depends on the circumstances, and I guess it can't be kind of ruled out if there is a legitimate government still somewhere. I mean, if country democratically has decided to change its government to something that is totally anti-NATO, or I don't know, for Russia, and then decides to do something that the rest of the NATO considers worth of Article 5, then it's would be a very peculiar situation, I must admit.
Absolutely.
Very theoretical, still.
Absolutely, but in Lithuania there was this decision to decentralize resistance to armed aggression. Basically, the military, even brigade and battalion commanders, can take a decision to resist armed attack without waiting for political orders from above. So you might even have a military action on the ground while the government is silent. And this is where we had this discussion. Perhaps it's time to decentralize also diplomatic decision making. That permanent representative to NATO could represent the sane voice of Lithuanian security and actually participate at these deliberations, even if the government is paralyzed or is not even there or divided. So this is a theoretical discussion, but it's an interesting one. This crisis is too good to be wasted not to consider these scenarios. Matt.
This is going to be a strange point coming from a Brit to talk about the EU, but the EU has a self-defence clause as well. There are several routes to respond here, and maybe that might be the more appropriate one and the more likely in terms of time and the best fit in response. And I think it's Article 42, but somebody else can correct me if I've got that.
Good point. But looking at the screen, it seems that majority, not a big majority, but still a majority, or sort of more than a half, it's not 70 or 80%, but think that yes, the NATO will come to the assistance of the Baltic states in the case of the attack. So on the back of this optimism, I would like to turn now to the members of the audience and ask if you have questions or points to challenge our speakers with. Yes, Ray, right there in the front. How is it work with the microphone? Do we have somebody? Yep.
Hey, thank you for the opportunity. Amazing talk, by the way. So I have many questions, but I'll just ask one. I think the status quo has been for a long time that Russia is the quote-unquote black sheep of the region. So, that's the threat. That's how it goes. The United States and NATO, I think, spend roughly 20 times more on their military and defense budgets than Russia does, and has been doing that for years. How is Russia still a threat? Like, how are you spending this money and Russia's still a threat by just kind of, just pushing less than 10 times money into their defense?
Good. Kari, Indrek, Mats?
We know from where now this US came from. Well, I mean, Estonia and Russia have, they have a history, and we shouldn't always be guided by history, but it is in our mind somewhere. And Russia has more recent history of invading other countries, Ukraine and Georgia. Yes, they are not members of NATO, and the US has no obligation to come for the defense. But still, I mean, solving your problems with your neighbors by military force and grabbing land, which by international law belongs to another nation, is something that you wouldn't expect after the Cold War, at least in Europe. So it's Russian actions and policies that is a threat to us. We don't know whether they are willing to use it against NATO, us, NATO, the US. At this point, there is very low probability that they are ready to do something like that. But we cannot rule it out totally, given the current regime in Russia, which is very aggressive when it comes to the vicinity of the borders and the nations, countries that are in this vicinity. So I guess that explains it.
That doesn't really answer my question. Thank you. But the question is, how is NATO spending 20 times more money and still keeping a economy that invests 10 times or 20 times less as the main threat? So my question is how the threat assessment even happens. So China spends roughly 5 times, China spends roughly 5 times the money that Russia does. The other regions do as well. Why are we still talking just about Russia? So why not China, who projects power elsewhere? How does that happen?
Well, threat is not only about capabilities and money you pour into your forces. It is about intent and your real actions. And the real actions happen not only on the, they don't happen in the military domain on a daily basis, but they happen in influence operations, undermining your elections recently in the US and elsewhere, and stirring trouble in your countries and using the opportunities to strike wedges between between different groups of your society. So this is also an aggressive action. It doesn't have to be a military attack necessarily.
Matt,
Can I just come back to the point about China, and again I'll reference back to the UK's integrated review. It mentioned 2 adversaries in there: Russia, quite pointedly, but also China and emerging China. Yes, both countries spend less than NATO, but their economies are different. They can still produce some very effective weapons, and weapons could be information, cyber, as well as hypersonic missiles, as well as aircraft carriers, the Chinese shipbuilding program, etc., etc. So you're not comparing the same cost of the item for a NATO very expensive European or American piece of kit with something made in Russia or China. There's no direct comparison. So you need to look at capability, and the capabilities and the intent are there. Therefore, they are threats, and therefore we have to respond. And you talked about Russia. If we want, why is it still viewed as a threat? The Russian regime. We'd all like it not to be a threat. We'd all like it not to come back into the international rules-based international order and behave along with those agreed international norms, so we can, in a democratic way that helps us all with free trade and international cooperation. That's not where we are today.
Kadi, yeah.
We're very briefly to add to what the other speaker said. Russia, of course, knows that it is not an equal to the whole of NATO. If everyone went ahead, with tanks, etc., etc., etc. But what Russia has is that it's first of all it's revisionist, and second of all it's opportunistic. So they are waiting and looking for opportunities where NATO is, for example, not united, where they see that they can drive wedges, where they see a vacuum happening somewhere in the world. I mean, look back a few years, a few years back, Russia was engaged in the Ukraine. They're still, have a lot of forces on NATO's borders, and everyone thought, no way they're going to be able to do anything else in any other place. But then they went to Syria. They filled the vacuum in Middle East. They're in Libya. They're in Africa. They're increasingly in Central African Republic. I mean, they're using different means and methods. So the fact that tank by tank or nuke by nuke, they are weaker doesn't mean that they don't have options.
And just to add a bit more frivolous note, we are open-minded, and in the future we don't mind looking at Russia not as a threat but as a buffer state between Estonia and China, and that will be one perspective of looking at things. I want to balance a little bit also with the online participation. There was a number of questions posed online. I want to pick perhaps one of those, and I will pick actually the one that is talking about, and probably this is what to Indrek also, and Kari, and also Matthew. What should a simple citizen of a state do to support national defense and cohesion as pillars of security? So I'm coming to you. I'm a simple citizen. What does that mean? I just have to become now, I don't know, a military reservist, or what is a simple citizen's role now in our security and defense?
I think there are many possibilities depending on the interest of a person. If person is really interested in providing directly to national defense mission, she or he can join Defense League or be a voluntary policeman or a voluntary firefighter. So there are a lot of those possibilities.
A hacker?
In the Cyber Defense League, maybe, yeah, why not? And one of the things that we've been trying to kind of introduce or deal with is to raise people's awareness of risks and resilience, and how to act and be in a crisis if something happens. If you have no electricity or power, what you should be doing, and what stores or what things you should have at home to kind of survive in this situation. And we are, very far from reaching all the people, but ministries and different organizations are dealing with this. But this is one thing: if an individual knows, like ABC or basics of how to, be and behave in a crisis situation, whatever it is, it may be a storm or a snowstorm or whatever, then it already adds a little bit to national resilience and resilience of society. So
brilliant point. Snap poll. Raise your hand if you have such plan for yourselves and your family. One,
have a radio with batteries.
2.5, maybe 3. Aha. I mean, this is a poor response rate. Either the government is doing something wrong in sort of impressing the citizens the need to do this, or the citizens are a bit lazy and complacent and are taking the security for granted. No.
It's a modern life, which makes it so much more difficult. You can go to a grocery store and buy a package of milk or a sandwich or something. It's so easy, so you don't really have to think ahead more than a couple of days. But yes, it is a challenge, but we have to deal with this.
I'll take one last question from the audience here. Anybody? Yes, in the back.
Thank you for a very nice discussion. I would like to broaden this discussion just a little bit out of the region. The panel was asking the question, do we take security for granted? In 2004, perhaps the Baltics and other states took NATO enlargement for granted. What I mean by that is do you foresee NATO enlargement continuing beyond maybe the countries that are already in? So do you foresee that the door is sort of closed, or are we seeing joining beyond the Western Balkans, talking Georgia and other states near that vicinity? Thanks.
Kadi, maybe? Would you pick on that?
Well, the official response is Estonia is a firm supporter of open doors policy and always will be. The reality of it is that 30 states have to agree, and that is very hard to see beyond the Western Balkans at this stage.
Good. I think I'll ask now if you have any final words, to wrap up. Going back to the original question, are we taking our security for granted? So I'll start now with the reverse order with Kadi, and then Matt and Indrek. Yeah. Any final thoughts?
Not at the moment. Maybe I'll pass it on to Indrek, and if I have anything, then I'll say.
Well, if we look at the polls regarding people's attitudes towards national defense, the numbers are pretty high when it comes to the questions: are you ready to participate in national defense? Are you ready to participate in military defense? and they've been high constantly, like throughout the years. Our defense budget enjoys a good support. Even people are ready to increase it. So I think it shows that we don't take it for granted. We don't take security for granted, and there is a majority of Estonian people that support more investments into defense, and understand also the threat picture. I would argue, looking from the threat cloud that we had.
Good point, Pat.
I think the British government absolutely not, and I think that was very well articulated in the integrated review, which laid out a vision, the current threat assessment, and a vision of the future and a way ahead. But the British people don't have a border with Russia. In fact, we don't have a border with anybody apart from the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So we have the public have a very different threat perception of what bothers them compared to the Estonian people or people who are in the Baltic states, because geography plays a part. Being an island nation gives you a certain degree of security. It gives you quite a lot of security. So I think from the average Brit, feel pretty secure and have done for a long time. But
Russia can reach you not only through the borders.
But that's not the view of the government, and that's not the view of the Ministry of Defence or our security services. So absolutely not taking it for granted.
Thank you very much.
I'll just agree with Indrek, Matt.
Thank you very much indeed for this great discussion, for your thoughts, for your involvement and answers in the poll. Also, thank you for our ICDS team in helping to put this up, and also for the British Embassy in Tallinn for putting so much effort into this panel. Also, hosts of the stage, giving us the floor and the space to share our thoughts. So, thank you once again, and enjoy your evening.